Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. Any long-term fans of a Street Fighter franchise will likely be able to remember the excitement of 1993, the year we would get 4 new fighters added to our favourite fighting game. Each of these memorable combatants would all have their own striking look, dazzling movesets and epic new themes and stages. This was a welcome addition to an already established classic, with each of these brand new fighters bringing something different and entertaining to the table. While most gamers are familiar with these faces, what less people will be clued up about is the amount of awesome lore that surrounds these heroes, as well as the level of care and attention that was put in to make each of these characters as stand out as possible. So today, let's change that and take individual looks at each of these iconic athletes' stories. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the history of the 4 new challengers. Yeah! 1993 was an exciting year to be a Street Fighter fan. Not only were we set to receive a new edition of the popular game for Capcom's snazzier System 2 arcade board hardware, but we were set to receive a version of the game that would contain 4 exciting new characters. What may come as a surprise to you to learn today is that the original 4 planned fighters who were set to be included in the game were not all the same ones that would make the final Super Street Fighter 2 release. Cammy and T-Hawk had always been on the table, but the additional 2 new slots were set to be allocated to 2 fighters who Capcom would later choose to cut from the game. Well, kind of at least anyway, as they would technically be merged into one fighter. The cancelled new challengers would be a set of twin martial artists from Hong Kong, whose look and fighting styles would both be based around Bruce Lee, essentially meaning the game had 2 Fei Longs planned at one point. Some speculate that the twin Fei Longs would influence characters who would later emerge in Street Fighter 3 in 1997, and although the Street Fighter 3 games were not given much love at the time, they have attracted a cult following today. The Lee brothers, known as Yun and Yang, are amongst the most beloved and popular of the new generation of fighters. So, could a pair of Hong Kong martial artists have been a hit back in the day too? And more importantly, why was such a concept dropped for Street Fighter 2? Well, this is where our star of today's topic, DJ, comes into play. A character who was obviously not intended to be in the game, as Capcom already had 4 new fighters commissioned for the title. So, what would change? The answer to this question lies with a man known as James Goddard, a gentleman who has been talked about in depth recently on my wife's channel Lady Decade, when she covered the existence of Street Fighter 2 Rainbow Edition. Rainbow Edition was a quirky, glitchy as hell Taiwanese bootleg of Street Fighter 2 that allowed players to throw multiple fireballs, switch who they played as mid-match, as well as do loads of other strange things. This insanity to some degree managed to overshadow the official reiteration of the game, Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition, a title that Goddard had worked tirelessly to co-balance while also serving as an apprentice designer. This would lead to him scrutinising Rainbow Edition and surmising that the main thing that made it so fun was its speed, and that playing his version of the game after made it feel like he was playing Street Fighter underwater. This would lead to him working with Capcom in Japan on Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting, which looked to improve on the game's speed. A task that he was met with great resistance with, as the Japanese team claimed they had already done all the correct research to ensure that the speed of the original was perfect, in order to give players time to think about inputs of moves properly. They almost seemed offended by his proposal. In fact, some in the company would go as far as to discredit his idea, based on the grounds that he was thinking from an American consumer's perspective, claiming American gamers have short attention spans and may appreciate an increase in speed. However, Capcom would be alienating their Japanese fan base by offering up a faster game that mechanically made less sense. To Goddard's delight though, the Japanese developers were quickly forced to eat humble pie, as hyperfighting not only proved hugely popular with Western audiences, but the Japanese public ate it up too, all in all improving Goddard's standing within Capcom and influence over the Street Fighter franchise overall. prior to the release of 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting, and cycling back round to our topic today, Goddard would also have an input when it came to selecting the new challengers for Super Street Fighter 2. Goddard would look at the 4 proposed characters for the next iteration of the game, and would conclude that he felt it would be redundant to include a pair of twins in the game who utilise exactly the same fighting style. Therefore, new characters should be created for the game. The first of these would of course be Fei Long, a character who would evolve from the 2 fighters who were canned from the title. As for the final addition to the lineup, Goddard felt something fresh was needed. After the team asked for his suggestion, he stated, and I quote, "A really kick-ass black character would be awesome," going on to state that when it came to Japanese game development at the time, black characters were usually cast in negative roles. The boxer from the previous game, for example, had been positioned as a cheating, dirty fighter who had aligned himself with an evil dictator and crime syndicate. DJ, on the other hand, would be positioned as a franchise hero. In Super Street Fighter 2, the man appears with a large muscular physique who wears orange loose drawstring pants with black sides and yellowish white lettering that reads Maximum, and orange sparring gloves. DJ's babyface persona would be put over strong, with the Jamaican kickboxer appearing in the games as kind-spirited, cheerful and happy-go-lucky. Well as someone can appear who carries those traits whilst beating the crap out of others. Basically, despite the situation, DJ is rarely seen without a smile on his face, which is further illustrated through the character's in-game poses, artwork and pictures. Like many characters who have been conceived for the Street Fighter universe, inspiration would as usual be taken from the real world. In DJ's case, inspiration was taken from Billy Blanks, an American fitness personality, martial artist, actor and creator of his own exercise program. His particular look and build for the game was directly inspired by Blanks' character in the 1999 movie The King of the Kickboxers, who Goddard considered to look like a badass. He began designing DJ by drawing a sketch of him and sending it to the Japanese team, but to give them further context, he would also send them a copy of The King of Kickboxers in the post. Speaking of Billy Blanks, back in 1976 he had developed a routine that combined dance with elements from his martial arts and boxing training to form a unique workout regimen. Pairing all of these elements together, DJ would be born as a fun-loving fighter who was trying to jumpstart a music career. Upon his debut in Street Fighter 2, DJ would enter the Second World Warrior Tournament, hoping to find new rhythm for his next album, leading to him crossing swords with some of the most iconic fighting game characters in history. In terms of his in-game fighting style, I have seen others in the past loosely comparing him to that of Guile, in that he is a charge character who has a good variety of defensive options up his sleeve. The breakdancing kickboxer, though, of course has his own unique attacks on offer, such as the double rolling Sobat that allows him to approach opponents, which discourages ground-based counters, or more notably, his jackknife Maximum and machine gun upper, which are perfect anti-air maneuvers. In Super Street Fighter 2, if players are able to defeat M. Bison and win the World Warrior Tournament, then his ending reveals that he managed to find the rhythm he was looking for, enabling him to deliver a smash hit album and in the process becoming a world famous recording artist. In the first half of the 90s, Street Fighter was a cultural phenomenon, which would by 1994 lead to a live action movie, whereby fans of the franchise would get to see DJ portrayed on the big screen. Rather than hire Billy Blanks, which I guess would have made too much sense, DJ would be portrayed by Miguel A. Nunez Jr. The writers of the movie for some reason decided to make the strange choice of redeciding who would be good guys and made bad guys in the movie, with Balrog being made a babyface and Zangief and DJ being made Shadaloo bad guys. This seemingly different character from the game is now one of Bison's minions, who now is a greedy computer hacker for some absurd reason, although he amusingly admits he should never have taken the job role, because at one point he utters, "Oh mon, I should have stayed at Microsoft." Bill Gates' former henchman DJ is portrayed as a competent underling in the movie, but when he notices that Bison is going to lose the war, he flees his base, stealing all of Bison's money. Sadly for DJ though, he quickly learns that with Shadaloo falling, that Bison dollars are as worthless as the Russian ruble, leading to him telling Zangief that Bison had just used them to rise to power in the criminal underworld. This results in one of the more comical moments in the film, with Zangief becoming enraged over learning that DJ was being paid, whereas he was working for nothing. This incarnation of DJ would obviously live on in video game form through the Street Fighter movie video games, further encapsulating this quirky chunk of history. That same year would also see the release of a Street Fighter 2 animated movie in Japan. While DJ was barely in the movie, at least his character and likeness was more in line with his identity that had been established in Super Street Fighter 2. In this one, he beats up a few punks causing trouble at a nightclub, before being warned by Guile and Chun-Li that he is being monitored by Shadaloo, which he does not believe until Chun-Li destroys one of their cyborgs in front of him. One notable difference though between this movie and the game is that in the English dub, he is portrayed to have an African American accent, though obviously in the game he is said to be Jamaican. He would also be a part of the American cartoon series that would function as a loose spin-off of the live-action movie. With this one though, they did have enough sense to switch DJ and Balrog back into their correct hero and villain roles. Although rather lazily, they would make Balrog the computer hacker this time. DJ is portrayed as a friendly and capable fighter in this one, serving as the team's helicopter pilot. While moving into the second half of the decade, while the Street Fighter franchise would be expanded, the DJ character, that was in part created by James Goddard, was nowhere to be seen. The arcade would see a trilogy of Street Fighter Alpha games, 3D polygonal Street Fighter EX games, the Street Fighter 3 games, and Marvel Capcom crossover fighters. But DJ wasn't in any of them. The Japanese team appeared to have moved on and now had included twin martial artists Yun and Yang within the Street Fighter 3 games, the characters they had originally wanted to support within the Street Fighter universe anyway. While this was the case, when Street Fighter Alpha 3 was ported to the Sony PlayStation, DJ along with the other missing Street Fighter 2 roster members would finally be added to Alpha 3, which meant that DJ's backstory would be fleshed out beyond the events of just Street Fighter 2. Alpha 3 occurs prior to the events of SF2, and DJ is depicted as a cheerful kickboxer who has already risen to the top of his division, so is now travelling the world looking for new challenges. Throughout the events of the game, he challenges and defeats Aiden, in the process discovering a new true purpose in life, finding and defeating Sagat, the so-called Emperor of Muay Thai. DJ soon learns though that Sagat has fallen from grace and now works for M. Bison, with Sagat refusing to take DJ seriously. Still they fight and DJ is victorious, making Sagat more depressed and twisted in the process. This victory catches the attention of M. Bison himself, who wants DJ for Shadaloo. Rather than becoming his personal computer hacker, DJ refuses, so M. Bison tries to kill him. But the skilled kickboxer manages to fend him off. DJ ends up returning to Jamaica, with his adventures inspiring him to make new music. In 2002, Alpha 3 Max would be released for the Game Boy Advance, a version of the game that would add 3 more characters to the mix, including the popular Yun from Street Fighter 3. This is relevant as the game sees Yun's story involving Yang, meeting DJ on a quest to find the whereabouts of Fei Long. A storyline that brings the 4 characters who contested against one another for Super Street Fighter 2 roster spots into the same game for the first time. Past this point, we would see nothing of DJ for many years, with him not resurfacing until the Street Fighter 4 games, but at least we would get to learn a little bit about what became of the character after the events of Street Fighter 2 and the Second World Warrior Tournament. Following on from his days of becoming a musical sensation, it was only a matter of time until the athlete began to feel restless, with the urge to compete in combat creeping back into his life. This would lead to him deciding to take a break from his music career to test his fighting capabilities once more, entering the Sin tournament in the process. This marks the first time in a video game where the character is provided with a voice actor, with DJ now speaking with a strong, thick Jamaican accent. There is no additional character development really given to DJ for this comeback, and Plan as him just sees him dancing and having a good time during battles. But I guess his happy-go-lucky attitude is a breath of fresh air in comparison to the ultra-serious tone that many other characters in the game and their arcs contain. While not adding much to Street Fighter 4 in terms of story, it is of note though that he is one of only 2 characters in these games who is capable of cancelling a super combo into an ultra combo, so at least he has that cool trick up his sleeve. Sadly past this point, that was the last we got to see of the character, bar him showing up in the remakes of Street Fighter 2. While James Goddard felt that DJ was a great addition to the Street Fighter lineup that was intended to make the roster more diverse, Capcom clearly did not seem to be as high on this character. Since I originally made a standalone video on DJ earlier in the year, the Street Fighter 6 fighting roster has since been leaked, and in a rather pleasant turn of events, DJ, with a brand new look updated for 2023, appears to be one of the intended playable characters for the game. So it looks like one of DJ's greatest spots in the gaming sunshine is still to come. There is no denying that DJ certainly diversified the Street Fighter 2 roster and gave new challenger players an extra reason to be excited ahead of the game. Other fighters may have come and overshadowed him in years to come at times, but I think that DJ was positioned very well in 1993. And 30 years later, in 2023, I am hoping he is going to do the same thing all over again. The new challenges certainly do seem to be continuing to make history. According to Noritaka Fanamizu, Capcom's research and development head at the time, he states that Kami's inclusion in Super Street Fighter 2 was a result of him feeling that the franchise needed more female characters rather than just Chun-Li. Like Chun-Li before her, Kami would be designed to utilise speed, unlike many male roster members who would rely on brutish strength. Kami was given a western look with her sporting blonde hair, blue eyes and a scar under her left cheek. Her level of sex appeal would also be ramped up, which was achieved by the designers depicting her wearing a green sleeveless thong leotard, a military red beret, red gloves, black boots and green camouflage stains on her legs. Kinky. In her maiden appearance, the character, who went by the full name of Kami White, was said to be a deadly assassin who had previously worked for Shadaloo. Shortly prior to the events of Super Street Fighter 2, Kami would awaken with amnesia and be taken in by a group known as Delta Red, a special forces with a headquarters set in the United Kingdom. Although she had no knowledge of her past, she retained all of her fighting capabilities. When the next World Warrior tournament was announced, Kami felt a strange connection to M. Bison, so entered the competition to try and learn more. In the events of Super Street Fighter 2, she would confront Bison, where he would tell her that he was the one responsible for planting her in Delta Red in the first place, but did not foresee her losing her memory, so had no further use for her. Once Bison is defeated, Delta Red keep Kami on, with her teammates encouraging her to continue to live her new life. In this game, along with future appearances, mechanically Kami features as a quick, close-range fighter. As a means to gain an advantage, she often hurls herself at opponents, relying on speed and priority. Her biggest chink in her armour in the early days was her ability to evade projectile attacks. However, she would improve in this area as the series progressed. Personality-wise, Kami would become well known for her strong, forceful and determined nature. However, on top of this, her strong sense of military discipline, honour and drive, paired with her warfare mindset, makes her a dangerous fighter to contend with. Despite all of this though, away from combat she is reportedly friendly, respectful and enthusiastic towards those she cares about. Just 1 year after the release of Super Street Fighter 2, a live-action Street Fighter movie would hit theatres. The film would be a huge commercial success, with a worldwide box office turning over 3 times its production costs. In this bizarre movie, Shadaloo is depicted as a southeastern country where a war is taking place between M. Bison, a drug lord turned general, against allied nations led by Guile. Kami in the movie features in the role of Guile's assistant, Sergeant Kami White, but perhaps more memorable than the actual story of the movie itself is that Cammy was portrayed by none other than Kylie Bloody Minogue, a woman who is considered a top-level pop star in many countries around the world. However, if you are really old school, you most likely remember her as Charlene from the Australian soap opera Neighbours. Everybody needs good neighbours. Cammy over the years would make a number of movie and television appearances, but in today's instance we're going to focus more on the games. Speaking of the games, we of course had the Street Fighter the movie games, which were the gaming counterparts to the live action movie. These games, like the Mortal Kombat series, represented combat via the usage of digitised actors. Cammy's appearances in these was notable for showing Kylie Minogue dressed in the same leggy arsey attire that Cammy wears in Super Street Fighter 2. Ooh. Although it is of note that many of the moves in the game were instead performed by Kylie's stunt double, Enna Kearney. Next, in gaming, Cammy would resurface twice in 1996. Firstly as a playable fighter in the crazy crossover fighting game known as X-Men vs Street Fighter. Then her same sprite would appear in Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold, an enhanced version of Alpha 2. Since the Alpha series is timeline-wise a prequel to the events of Street Fighter 2 games, the games are set when Cammy is still part of Shadaloo, working for M. Bison. In this game, she is depicted wearing a light blue thong leotard that has a small yellow tie attached to the front of her turtleneck. This is paired with a small blue garrison cap, knee-high brown boots, and red gauntlets, similar to her classic incarnation. To illustrate the placing of time further, her winning pose even sees her salute M. Bison. Due to only being added as a playable fighter in the gold version of Alpha 2, sadly her appearance does not fit into Alpha 2's story canon. However, more about her past would be outlined in Alpha 3. In this part of the story, she starts out as a soulless doll who is sent to assassinate Dhalsim. However, he is successful in using his spiritual powers to give her self-awareness. Coming to the realization that Shadaloo was controlling her, Bison sends Vega to observe the female fighter. Vega eventually confronts her, informing her she is an experiment that is no longer needed, but ultimately lets her live after having a fight with her, where he admits underestimating her. She later encounters Julie and Junie, two other Shadaloo dolls, who lack the benefit of self-awareness. Eventually confronting Bison himself, he informs her that she exists solely to become his next body after his current physical manifestation has been destroyed by his psycho power. During this confrontation with Bison, Cammy manages to break the other dolls free from the Shadaloo's mind control. During this escapade, Bison reveals she is actually a clone of himself, who even possesses a portion of psycho power herself, and if he dies, she dies as well. During this confrontation, Cammy fights gallantly against Bison's psychic probing and control over her, but while trying to escape, she unfortunately falls unconscious. While unconscious, Vega manages to rescue her from the base before it is destroyed, leaving her on Delta Red's doorstep, setting up the events of Super Street Fighter 2, bringing good cohesion to the story. In the years that followed, Cammy would continue to make appearances as a playable fighter in non-Street Fighter canon games, such as Marvel vs Capcom 2, Capcom vs SNK, and Capcom vs SNK 2. But aside from this, while she was not a playable character in any of the Street Fighter 3 games, she does make appearances in certain endings. In Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, a game that story-wise takes place after Street Fighter 2, bizarrely in these endings she wears the same attire as in Street Fighter Alpha 3, even though the events of Street Fighter 3 unfolded years later, which is certainly odd to say the least, but then again, what isn't odd about Street Fighter 3 games? I guess this may have been done to replicate her appearances in all of the other Capcom crossover games that all reused the Alpha 2 Gold X-Men vs Street Fighter sprite. In a more quirky appearance, Cammy would appear in Cannon Spike for the Dreamcast in the year 2000. This bizarre multi-directional shooter plays similar to the likes of Smash TV, although with a primary focus on boss fighting. Not only is Cammy featured in this game as a playable character, among other Capcom offerings, but more impressively than that, the game is named after one of her trademark attacks, obviously known as the Cannon Spike, which is proof of how valuable Cammy became to Capcom over the years. Both her Shadaloo and Delta Red costumes are available in the game as well. While the Street Fighter franchise itself would lay dormant for a number of years, in the late noughties it would return with Street Fighter 4. a game story-wise that ridiculously is set halfway between Street Fighter 2 and 3. In the game's story, fellow Delta Red member Colonel Wolfman informs Cammy that a mysterious group known as Sin has built a dam in India, cutting off the water supply to her old friend Dalsim's village. Surveillance photos soon reveal that the Sin operatives in the area are shockingly bearing the Shadaloo insignia. In the Super Street Fighter 4 original video animation, Seth, the leader of Sin, sends Jury to capture Shadaloo dolls Junie and Julie. Jury is a brutal South Korean taekwondo martial artist who derives pleasure from inflicting pain on others. Cammy and Guy, who arrive on the scene just after Jury has left the dolls unconscious, and despite Cammy's efforts to warn Guy of an incoming attack, he is unable to dodge Jury's fierce moves and is too defeated. Despite her best efforts, Cammy is overwhelmed by Jury as well, but later enters the Sin tournament to get revenge on her on behalf of the dolls she considers her sisters. In the tournament, she defeats Jury, and Junie eventually wakes up from her coma, and the game ends with Cammy promising to help her recover. Cammy would also go on to appear in Street Fighter V, which story-wise occurs after 4 but before 3. The story of the game features Shadaloo initiating Operation Chains, which consists of launching 7 artificial satellites into orbit known as the Black Moons. Planning to spread fear and despair, this can be used to source Bison's psycho power and siphon this energy in order to render him and his forces invincible. During the game, warriors travel the world searching for pieces that control these Black Moons, and during this war for control, Cammy defeats and restrains her sister, the Capri, who has been brainwashed by the Shadaloo. Speaking of the Capri, she had already previously surfaced as a playable fighter in Ultra Street Fighter 4, and before that in Julie and Junie's introduction in Street Fighter Alpha 3. Her appearance in Ultra 4 though is more important here, as she is revealed to be an imperfect product of Shadaloo cloning experiments that would eventually result in Cammy's actual creation. She has a strong resemblance to Cammy, but speaks with a strong Russian accent. Knowing of her brainwashing, Cammy refuses to surrender her to the police, even receiving Jury's help along the way. After enough warriors have gathered enough pieces to deactivate the moons, together they storm the Shadaloo base. During this final encounter against Shadaloo, to Cammy's shock, she finds that all of the other dolls have come under control of Fang, a Shadaloo member introduced in Street Fighter V. She ends up fighting and eventually defeating Julie, and Vega ends up taking on Cammy next, defeating her, but she is saved by the Capri who blocks his claw. Suddenly, Jury arrives, almost crashing her motorbike into the group. Jury challenges Vega with Cammy glancing at the Capri, wondering why she had saved her. Jury is truthful in claiming that she wants to help her, partly out of jealousy of the Capri. Vega attacks Jury and the two of them fight. Meanwhile, Cammy and the Capri are surrounded by the remaining dolls, erupting into a big fight. The device that controls the dolls is destroyed during this encounter, and after Cammy and the Capri defeat the other dolls, Cammy notices that the psycho power surrounding them has disappeared. At the end of it all, the sisters are finally reunited. Cammy's story closes with a final scene of Jury and Cammy watching Shadaloo's destruction, bringing the whole affair to an end. Away from the canon, over time Cammy would prove a popular enough Capcom character that she would make countless appearances in many Capcom titles over the years. This would include the terrible Final Fight Streetwise game, where she would appear as a bonus character who appears in the in-game tournament section. She would also surface in Street Fighter Cross Tekken. This game even features a story whereby Cammy teams up with Chun-Li, working together to stop Shadaloo and Tekken's villains from securing Pandora's box. She would also appear in Namco Cross Capcom, a mobile RPG known as Blood Brothers 2, and as a class leader in Shadowverse, and even as a playable character in Power Rangers Legacy Wars. Cammy's appearances are vast and sprawling, with too many to really even count, across various forms of media. Her impact in the world of Street Fighter, fighting games, and just video games overall is almost undeniable. Cammy is a character with a memorable look, a timeless appeal, and even an intriguing enough backstory that it makes her interesting away from her fantastic look and magnificent moveset. Cammy is one of the true impact players in the world of fighting games, which is why I thought her time in gaming would be worth looking at and celebrating today. Amongst this foursome, the game titled Super Street Fighter 2 The New Challengers would introduce to players the exciting prospect of being able to play as Fei Long, a character who seemed to look and move like legendary film star and martial artist Bruce Lee. Now including a character based on such a fighting legend fit the theme of the game perfectly. Hell, we already had a boxer who was practically Mike Tyson, and a Muay Thai fighter named Sagat, who looked suspiciously like the real-life Muay Thai world champion fighter Sagat Pechindi. So, influence from real life for the Street Fighter franchise was at this point almost expected. While we will dive into the differences and similarities between Fei Long and Bruce Lee shortly, let me first touch on why a Bruce Lee based character was arguably the most perfect homage to feature in the game as of yet. Apart from the fact that Bruce Lee and Hong Kong martial arts movies had helped popularise martial arts in the West, Street Fighter 2 The World Warrior took more inspiration from Bruce Lee's career than one would think, and all of this relates to the smash hit movie known as Enter the Dragon. There are many similarities between this classic flick and the iconic game, as aside from both of them featuring a plot whereby challengers from around the world would face off in a martial arts tournament, the leading villains in each piece have striking similarities. The dictator known as M. Bison or Vega, depending where you live in the world, plays the role in Street Fighter 2 of being a crime lord, hosting a fighting tournament, with this plot and character replicating Enter the Dragon's crime lord and main villain known as Han, who is hosting a tournament of his own. In terms of shamelessly ripping off this movie, Street Fighter 2's crime lord is being pursued by a female undercover cop Chun-Li, which again directly copies Enter the Dragon's female undercover operative Mai Ling, who is pursuing Han. Now you could be thinking, big deal right, two characters in the game that link to this movie. However, when you dig a little deeper, it quickly becomes clear that earlier in its development, that the entirety of Street Fighter 2 was set to be an Enter the Dragon homage. Not only was a crime lord set to run a tournament, but he was set to do so on his own private island, wherein which the entire game would have taken place. Essentially, M. Bison would have owned his own island just like Han in the Kung Fu favourite. Some design from this earlier concept would make it into the final game, such as the island's port area being repositioned as Ken's stage. So bringing all that we know into account, the inspiration Street Fighter 2 took from Enter the Dragon is clear to see. So a Bruce Lee lookalike being thrown into the mix in 1993 made perfect sense really. Street Fighter 2 is pretty much built for Fei Long. Fei Long, like Bruce Lee, originates from Hong Kong and debuts in the World Warrior tournament in the Super Street Fighter 2 plot, after appearing in a string of action movies. It is of note that Fei Long is Chinese for Flying Dragon, which is similar to Bruce Lee's Chinese screen name that was Little Dragon. His fighting style in the game is obviously a type of Kung Fu that features a variety of acrobatic kicks and rigid strikes. Fei Long can bob and weave his way around the playfield, putting pressure on opponents, allowing him to close gaps and strike hard at the right opportunities. In Super Street Fighter 2, Fei Long became well known for executing two special techniques: the Rekaken, a series of rushing punches, and the Rising Dragon Leg, a jumping flaming kick. Throughout the World Warrior tournament, it would dawn on Fei Long that he much preferred fighting in real life in comparison to the staged, choreographed fight scenes in movies that he had become accustomed to. Still, if players can beat the game using this character, a movie director comes and congratulates Fei Long, attempting to sign him up for a new movie deal. But Fei Long declines, choosing to return to the world of real martial arts. The Western version of the game does offer a bit of extra dialogue though, with Fei Long stating there can never be another legend like the Great One and his son. Basically referencing Bruce Lee and his son Brandon Lee coexist alongside Fei Long in Capcom USA Street Fighter universe. Weird. The early 90s was obviously a super hot time for the Street Fighter franchise. So while Street Fighter 2 started life out as a game that would be based on the movie Enter the Dragon, by 1994 Street Fighter would have its very own live action movie to call its own. Sadly though, Fei Long was the only character from the new challengers to not be featured in live action form, with the reason for his absence being rather interesting in its own right. The lack of Fei Long in the flick appears to stem from the fact that the movie would feature actor Kenya Sawada. Interestingly, Sawada would audition to play the role of Ryu, But by this point, not only had the movie staff chosen Byron Mann for the role, but Sawada spoke very little English, so casting him in such a prominent role made no sense. Still, Capcom of Japan loved this Japanese actor, so it seems they would remove the Bruce Lee-esque Fei Long character from the story and create a new character bespoke for the movie known as Sawada, who would be named after, well, Sawada. What makes this all the more hilarious was that all of this was done on the basis that Capcom of Japan intended to build an entire movie empire around this man, but it would appear that he would end up to Capcom what Tom McGee would end up to Vince McMahon in the World Wrestling Federation. Now that's an obscure reference. His movie career with Capcom would end up limited to his appearance in Street Fighter, where amusingly he would only be seen speaking and fighting a couple of times within the film. Yet he ends up posing with the famous cast of Street Fighter characters at the end of the movie, leaving audience members everywhere scratching their heads in confusion. What on earth was going on here? This marketing disaster that seems to have led to Fei Long getting cut would mean that Sawada would also feature as a player fighter in the Street Fighter the movie video games, and to really rub salt in the wound, Sawada's ending features a remix of Fei Long's stage soundtrack. While this was a dark time for our hero, fortunately this would not be the end of his tale. The same year the live-action Street Fighter movie hit cinemas, a Japanese animated Street Fighter 2 film would also be produced, with this one including our favourite Bruce Lee lookalike. While only making minor appearances, some representation is better than nothing, eh? And these segments are pretty cool to say the least. In the movie, he has a hard-hitting one-on-one dream match with Ryu, even unleashing some of his trademark manoeuvres from the game in the process. While ultimately losing this bout, he comes to terms with his loss later in the movie after learning that Ryu was the man who beat Sagat a few years earlier. To make Fei Long in this animation all the cooler though, is that in the English translation of the movie, Fei Long was voiced by none other than a young Bryan Cranston. The same Bryan Cranston who would go on to play drug dealer Heisenberg in the hit show Malcolm in the Middle. Now that's what I call Fei Long star power. While on the subject of animations, Fei Long would also be a part of Street Fighter 2V, the Japanese episodic TV series. Fei Long will be first introduced as a student of Chun-Li's father. One day, thinking it is a real fight, he storms a movie set, injuring various stuntmen in the process. Rather than apologising, he proceeds to tell an already enraged director that real fights would make the film better, so recruits Ken for help. The pair proceed to fight, destroying the film set in the process, resulting in a rather silly episode. In a future episode, he returns in an installment with a more serious tone, whereby he pursues Shadaloo, who he suspects has murdered Chun-Li's father. Fei Long would also feature in the Western cartoon from this time period. Weirdly, in Fei Long's most significant episode in the series, it too would feature a weird plot involving Ken. In this episode, investors withdraw support for Fei Long's movie due to it featuring Chinese criminal syndicates, so they cancel his product altogether. Ken ends up getting his rich father to fund the movie in exchange for Ken to become an executive producer. Fei Long hates the plan but goes along with it anyway. Fame soon goes to Ken's head, making him more arrogant, and the pair end up coming to blows. This results in the pair destroying the set again. Slapstick, silly stuff really. As for the world of gaming, the Street Fighter 2 prequels known as the Alpha series would begin to be rolled out in 1995, with Fei Long nowhere to be seen. By the second installment, Street Fighter Alpha 2, we still had no Fei Long as a playable character, however he would cameo in the background of Dan Hibiki's stage, watching the action take place. In fact, he wouldn't show up in Street Fighter Alpha 3 in 1998 either. However, he would finally become part of the roster when the home version saw release on the Sony PlayStation, with him also being included in Alpha 3's arcade update known as Alpha 3 Upper. In his character story in this game, it reveals Fei Long's backstory from before the days he competed in the World Warrior Tournament, or even when he was a movie star. In the game, his martial arts skills attract the attention of Shadaloo, who want to recruit him by force. Beating the game as Fei Long and destroying M. Bison's Psycho Drive results in him starring in a film based around the events. This catapults him to superstardom. The next few years would be quiet for the character, missing out on representation in the Marvel vs. Capcom games, Capcom vs. SNK titles, and the Street Fighter 3 and Street Fighter EX games. The best it got for our Bruce Lee lookalike was a cameo in the Noodle stage, and in Felicia's ending in Super Gem Fighter Minimix. He also had placement in the background of a Hong Kong stage in Capcom Fighting Evolution, and placement in a poster that can be found in Resident Evil Survivor. The character was barely being seen compared to his previous success. After over a decade of not being playable, Fei Long would finally return to the fold in Super Street Fighter 4, the update of Street Fighter 4 in the first game of the series to showcase our Kung Fu star in events that chronologically follow the action of Street Fighter 2. It seems that unlike the plot of Street Fighter 2 previously suggested, Fei Long did indeed transition back into a movie career. However, he is not too pleased when he learns that Sin operatives are suspected of attacking stagehands and his co-stars of the film he is working on. So Fei Long sets off on a journey to get revenge against the troublemakers. In this return to action, Fei Long retains the moveset that made him famous, but can now utilise new attacks such as the Tenshin, a manoeuvre that involves hooking an opponent's leg and flipping them over. He can also perform a new Ultra combo, and can counter certain attacks by delivering a hard jump kick to the back of an opponent's leg, followed with a barrage of quick punches, topped off with a devastating 1-inch punch. Yeah! In this new adventure, he encounters Makoto, who wants to fight him to build her dojo's reputation, and later Abel, a man who it transpires is a massive admirer of Fei Long's work. Eventually, he catches up with the man responsible for attacking his crew, Seth. When Fei Long demands answers from Seth for his awful conduct, he spits out words that sound like they came from Vladimir Putin's playbook, stating, "Sometimes the media can get too close to the truth." As he is about to learn more about Seth's agenda, a ninja throwing dagger kills Seth before he can gather any more information. Returning to the film set, he meets Abel once more, who warns him about how dangerous Sin and Shadaloo are. Fei Long though states that's not a problem, wondering where to begin. Past the Street Fighter 4 games, that would just about be the last who would see Fei Long as a playable character up until this point, but he has made a few cameos here and there. This includes being mentioned in passing by Pai-chan within Project X Zone, and a very brief appearance in Rashid's story in Street Fighter 5. In this one, he is reduced to a social media communication with a Middle Eastern character, whereby with his username Fei Long Dragon, he states that his new movie is opening and enthusiastically requests that people go see it. If it's true that Fei Long now cares more about movies and promoting himself on social media, it would not surprise me if Fei Long was now taking money to promote mobile games in his spare time, such as Raid Shadow Dragons, the kung fu game that changed everything. Now, considering how important the career of Bruce Lee and the movie Enter the Dragon are in relation to the existence of Street Fighter 2, it is quite surprising how thin Fei Long's appearances have been over the years in comparison to other fighters from the franchise. People sometimes laugh about this character just being a Bruce Lee ripoff, but so is most of the lore in the franchise overall. Without the success of Bruce Lee and Hong Kong martial arts movies, it is doubtful we would even have fighting games as we know them today. In fact, the whole genre has regularly paid homage to this kung fu movie legend, with the likes of World Heroes, Kim Dragon, Fatal Fury's Hon Fu, Tekken's martial law, just to name a few. Speaking of these clones, one final fact to round this video off would involve martial law, who would get to do battle with the cast of Street Fighter within the crossover game Street Fighter Cross Tekken, whereby amusingly, some of the characters in this game mistake him for being Fei Long. But this just further embeds Bruce Lee's legacy within the fighting game scene, to see two of his clones feature in exactly the same story. There are many key figures who have worked on the Street Fighter franchise over the years, who have helped shape the brand that we all know and love now. One of these key figures is of course James Goddard, a man who would get to play Street Fighter 2, The World Warrior, at SmvR Golfland, way back in January of 1991. The Street Fighter 2 lover would end up landing a job at Capcom within months of experience in the game, ending up becoming an apprentice designer for the game's first arcade reiteration, known as Champion Edition, which he would co-balance. Past this point, he would become a co-lead for the development of Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting, a game with increased play speed that he had pitched to be created himself. But a chapter of his career that is rarely talked about is his involvement in the creation of Super Street Fighter II, the game that would include the 4 new challenges. James has kindly offered to help with today's video, so without further ado, over to him. Yeah.
Okay, Big Daddy Top Hat. Here is a story from way back in 1993. Besides being a game designer in training under my Japanese mentors, I had also built and managed Capcom USA's R&D support team, which handled location testing, feedback, and localization. This team included Dave Winstead, Alex Jimenez, Joe Gaines, and myself, all working from the Capcom USA Sunnyvale office. Over time, this grew into helping also with brainstorming story adjustments and character names that would just work better in both Japan and Western markets. We also did some very early work in cultural awareness to make sure characters were better represented in games like Slam Masters and Super Street Fighter II. Our support team has a lot of cool stories about working with Capcom Japan. For example, recently you may have heard the story about when I created DJ. But a story that has never been fully told is what happened when we first saw T-Hawk's original concept while on location test at Capcom's Yellow Brick Road in La Jolla, California. The team from Japan had brought Polaroids of the 4 new Super Street Fighter II characters for me to review and for my team to provide feedback on. I asked Japan for permission to pull in our friend and Yellow Brick Road employee Steve Patton, who had Native American family, so we could give better feedback on T-Hawk. Steve was able to help us quickly provide feedback talking with the team on site, and it eventually led to a version that was more culturally appropriate. Steve has gone long uncredited for this work. Let me introduce you to Steve Patton.
Steve Patton was a gentleman who was key in shaping the image of the T-Hawk, who we all know and love today. Without his input on the project, we would likely have gotten a very different looking character. James was kind enough to relay my questions to this undersung hero, so that we could all learn more about this new challenger's origins than ever before. Steve reveals to us that in the early days, the original concepts he was shown from Capcom would display a character with an Elvis hairdo sporting a full Native American headdress, the sort of which is worn by tribal leaders. Steve would look at this and instead propose that the character should wear a headband adorned with 2 feathers due to, in his own words and opinion,
the Native American Indian appearance as it was portrayed in so many times previously in media made frequent use of the headdress, also known as a war bonnet. To me, that diminished its real-world significance in Native American culture. That, and it was just too played out, so I felt his appearance needed something new. As for the Elvis hairdo, it just didn't look right, and didn't fit in with his overall appearance.
Patton went on to mention that when it comes to Street Fighter characters and T-Hawk's design, it was somewhat of a balancing act, as he had to fit in with the Street Fighter lore and art style alongside a roster of other over-the-top looking characters, so there was only so much he could do. Steve states,
They had to be more than just characters, they had to have character visually. So my aim was to, at the very least, try to avoid making him racially offensive as best I could.
In regards to T-Hawk's name, Patton states that,
in a discussion with a member of Japan's R&D team during a local test in San Diego, the first name I proposed was Thunderbird, but the name didn't translate well into Japanese according to them. So, working forward from there, it evolved into Thunderhawk, which they liked. But I also proposed that if a more traditional naming convention was preferable, we could alternatively use Thomas Hawk. So that was the name we settled on, but it was then abbreviated as T-Hawk in the end.
After much refinement to get the character as close to perfect as possible, T-Hawk would eventually debut in Super Street Fighter II. T-Hawk would stand out from the pack as an immensely tall and muscular man. His iconic look features paint on his cheeks and lower jaw, with him wearing clothing consisting of a denim vest and jeans, with iron braces entirely covering both forearms. He also wears thin steel armbands around his biceps, a cowboy-esque brown leathery belt with a huge buckle and metal decorative tokens, moccasin boots, and a blue and white triangular patterned headband ostentating a pair of eagle feathers, the very feathers that were suggested by our friend Steve Patton. Like other combatants in the game, he would enter the second World Warrior tournament with a goal of defeating M. Bison. M. Bison and his Shadaloo syndicate have stolen T-Hawk's people's land. So he vows to defeat the tyrant, reclaim his land and liberate it from tyranny. Now living in Mexico near the Monte Alban plains, T-Hawk wants nothing more than revenge against the dictator. T-Hawk is an imposing fighter who at the point of his debut was the tallest fighter to appear in Street Fighter as of yet. It is said that this mammoth of a man is equal in strength to even Zangief, but has a lot more finesse in combat. Amongst his arsenal of moves, he has some devastating maneuvers from the likes of a Tomahawk Buster, Condor Dive and patented Mexican Typhoon techniques. What further sets T-Hawk apart from the competition with others in combat is that despite his size, T-Hawk is not a grappler, but instead often relies on huge swooping aerial attacks in order to crush his opponents. If a gamer is able to play through Super Street Fighter 2 as T-Hawk and overcomes M. Bison, a scene is shown whereby the native holds the dictator by the throat, demanding to know why he drove his people from their land. This sees Bison defiantly telling the native it's because he takes whatever he wants and no one can stop him. Despite M. Bison's words, the game's ending does indeed show that T-Hawk gets his land back. However, it is now desolate and empty. In spite of this, T-Hawk is determined and vows to make his land as great as it once was and bring the Thunderfoot people back to their home. Just one short year after his debut in Super Street Fighter 2, the new challenger would make it to the big screen as a character within the big budget Street Fighter live action movie. In this film that would retcon all previous Street Fighter material, T-Hawk's story and image would be completely different to the one that had been created with the help of Capcom USA's research and development support team. Played by Greg Rainwater, the man portraying the character looks way too small and scrawny to look anything like the beloved new challenger, and serves as nothing more than a military man under the leadership of Guile, leading to his inclusion in the movie being rather lackluster. To further illustrate how little he was valued with regards to the film, T-Hawk would be left out of the video games that were based on this flick as well. In Japan, in that same year, an animated movie would be produced, with this version of the character looking much more faithful to his portrayal in the video game. In this one, he finds and challenges Ken, putting up a great fight against one of the story's main protagonists. In the American animated show that loosely follows the canon of a live-action movie, T-Hawk would once again appear with a likeness in line with the games and would make multiple appearances throughout the series run. T-Hawk's next video game appearance would occur when he surfaced in the home versions of Street Fighter Alpha 3, a game that follows a chapter of his life prior to his entry into the World Warrior Tournament in Super Street Fighter 2. Alpha 3 is set shortly after members of the Thunderfoot tribe have begun disappearing, with T-Hawk believing that Shadaloo are the ones who are responsible. He soon learns that they are indeed the ones who forced his tribe to relocate, and even murdered his father, so T-Hawk begins trawling the planet looking for the organisation's leader, M. Bison. After mowing down most of the game's opponents and making it near the end, T-Hawk encounters one of Bison's bodyguards, Shadaloo doll, Julie, who he quickly identifies as a woman from his village known as Julia, who after interacting with becomes clear has been brainwashed. In the final battle with M. Bison, Bison reveals that he stole the land in order to make T-Hawk and his people hate him, as hatred is the source of M. Bison's psycho powers. T-Hawk manages to defeat the dictator with him escaping, but is fortunately able to save Julia, but sadly not from the brainwashing. His final moment of the game sees him stating he foresees himself fighting M. Bison again, an obvious nod to their encounter in Super Street Fighter 2. Gamers would not get to learn anything further about what would become of T-Hawk until the release of Super Street Fighter 4 in 2010, a game that canonically takes place after the World Warrior Tournament in the Street Fighter 2 games. In T-Hawk Super Street Fighter 4 story cutscenes, it illustrates that T-Hawk's land has begun to recover, but is still not close to its former glory. Further to this, T-Hawk doesn't feel he is worthy of becoming the next Thunderfoot tribe chief, due to ultimately not being able to save Julia. To attempt to atone, T-Hawk enters the Sin Tournament, which sees him face off against new and familiar foe alike. If T-Hawk overcomes Seth at the end of the game, he then meets Rose, who is able to tell him where Julia is, but has to warn him that she has become a shell of her former self. T-Hawk finds Julia in the care of an elderly couple, but she is in an awful mental state. She is not even able to recognise T-Hawk or even his presence. Sadly, up until now, this would be T-Hawk's last appearance in the Street Fighter IV story, with it being questionable whether this ending was canon to begin with, as Julia re-emerges as a Shadaloo doll in Street Fighter V, with the events between the two games being unclear. While T-Hawk has made less appearances over the years than many members of Street Fighter's lineup, there is no doubt that with his inclusion as one of the new challengers at Street Fighter II's height of popularity, that T-Hawk is indeed an iconic fighter. Bearing all of this in mind, I capitalised on the opportunity to ask Steve Patton himself his opinions on the character's future, and if he thinks T-Hawk has aged well. Patton stated,
I guess it depends on who you ask. Street Fighter purists would probably say yes. On the other hand, though, those who are maybe a bit more progressive might disagree and feel that he should change with the times, look more true to life and less the historical stereotype. But if you change who he is, then you lose the essence of the character that players liked in the first place. So for me anyway, I do prefer that he stay as true to his original design as possible.
Learning today that T-Hawk was designed to look less stereotypical than Native American characters who appeared in most Japanese-made video games back in the day, I also asked him if he felt representation had gotten better, with him stating,
It's been a slow uphill road, but yes. Sadly, that was not always the case though, especially going back into the earliest days of video games like Oregon Trail. However, I think it was around 2000 or so when some game developers finally started to take more positive steps as to how they represented Native Americans in their games. A personal favorite being the original Prey, which came out in 2006, a game still in my collection to this day. They not only centered the story on a well-written character, Tommy Tabori, but the voice actor, Michael Greyeyes, was also Native American and had a fair bit of creative input on the game's development as well.
As we move further into the future of gaming, we now find ourselves getting closer to the release of Street Fighter VI, the next mainline entry from the famous franchise. So this got me thinking what Steve would propose for the character if he had a consultation role working on that game. Mr. Patton stated that,
given how much time has passed since he was created, maybe now they could finally give him an alternate skin to include the full headdress. I think he's waited long enough.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the story of the 4 new challengers. There is far more to these characters' history and backstory than what may perhaps meet the eye, with way more thought, love and attention going into their designs than many other video game characters from that era of entertainment. Steve Patton, James Goddard and his team were taking steps forward to consider more appropriate representation in video games way before most corporate companies even had frameworks for such things in place. Proof of this can be found through the thoughtful design process that went into the creation of characters like T-Hawk. Before I conclude this video, I would like to give a huge thank you to Steve Patton for bringing his unique memories to the table, and of course to James Goddard for not only hooking me up with Steve, but lavishing us with additional info and providing his dulcet tones for this episode. Their contributions to the fourth quarter of this upload were invaluable. Obviously it probably goes without saying by this point, but I would also like to give a massive thank you to everyone who has had the patience to watch this video to the end. And if you are new here and found this video due to the algorithm's love for long form content, then there are plenty more character retrospectives like this one that you can check out if you like too. I've covered the 4 Grandmasters in the past, for example. Videos like this on the lesser told chapters of gaming history are partially possible due to the additional support I receive via Patreon. This means I focus on creating the most interesting videos possible instead of solely chasing views. Speaking of my backers, special shout outs go out to A Murder of Crows, Carl Johnson, Sebastian Velez, Heo Paulo Lopez, Nostalgia Collector, Ben Harradine, Corey Omar Sr., Ryan Dinch, Evan Boyler, Philip Manth, Azarakai, Joaquin Varela, Michael Calix, Ego, Jordan Durant, Ian Boyle, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Johnny Holly, August Piazza, Justin Wang, Capcom vs SNK, Hermes Gonzalez, Man Shovel, Michael Hall, Sang Hee, Norma Sticks, Langston Miller, Noob, Sarah Powell, Vlaming, Renee, Marvin Araliga, TOG Driver, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bale, Chris Fisk, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Synth Spaces, Punk Toast, Steve, Awesome Jacket Dude, and everybody else who backs what I do on the Patreon platform. It is very much appreciated. Yeah, cheerio.